some of you are getting a little bit cabin bound and maybe even stir crazy. But as we shared yesterday, if you think it is difficult with shelter in place, just imagine being in a 10 by 12 room for 14 days, which is what Joel Rosenberg is doing right now. And I'm aware of others that are in similar kinds of situations. So enjoy the freedom that you have. And let's, if we can, spend some time, obviously, talk about the coronavirus. But we're going to be doing some other things as well. I recognize that after a while you get tired of hearing about this. I will, of course, want to start off by talking about the fact that we have just now basically reached agreement and shortly will have passed and signed the largest rescue package in the history of this country. And so I want to talk about what is in it. Actually, I might start by talking about what isn't in it, all the things that Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, some of the radical groups were trying to put on it. And matter of fact, we have, one of the articles I suggested to Karen put up just about a half an hour ago would be some of that material. But again, we also will talk about the fact that there is a real push right now to hold China accountable. This is a bipartisan push. Is it going to go anywhere? I mean, maybe something through the World Trade Organization or a variety of other things, but we'll talk about that. And then if you want to understand what it's like when you really have run out of resources and beds, we're going to talk about what is happening in the state of New York. But in the next hour, either in the second half hour or first half hour, whatever we kind of will do, I want to give you an update from a number of different states, and I want to wait till we have those states online, not just New York, but California, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, New Mexico, Oregon, Colorado, Connecticut, and Maine, to different reports on the limited number of hospital beds or ventilators that are actually transpiring and illustrating again that even if the mortality rate is lower than we ever might have anticipated and as low as many people hope that it would be, and even if the morbidity cases are few, that would be places where you have scarring on the lungs, nevertheless, that remaining percentage that are indeed affected by the coronavirus are taking up more and more hospital beds, and the situation is looking more difficult all the time. We will also spend some time talking about when will this all be over? Who knows? I think the president's comments yesterday about, we'll be back to normal by Easter are unbelievably optimistic. I want to be optimistic too, but I'll give you reasons why that doesn't make a great deal of sense. But let's face it, while Mike Pence, the vice president, is looking at the medical health and physical health of the nation, President Donald Trump is looking at the financial health of America, and with the argument that was made by a number of people, including by Kelly Shackelford here last Friday, that we will have a V. We'll go down and then we'll come back up. The V is starting to look like more like a U or more like a long tunnel that eventually will come back up. And so there are some real questions that we will be talking about in that regard. I'm going to postpone some of that to the next hour because I wanted the entire national audience to hear that. And in the next couple hours, let me just mention that we're going to have Scott Sauls with us. He is the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville. He's been on the program with us before. Going to talk about his book, A Gentle Answer. He'll be on for about a half an hour. Our secret weapon in an age of us against them, and at a time when we still have politicized discussions and tribalism, this will be just a needed message and perspective that we'll be talking about with him from about 1 o'clock to 1:30. Then we'll get back into some of the coronavirus material. And then at 2 o'clock, Pastor Robert Jeffress, of course, pastor of the 13,000-member First Baptist Church in Dallas, will be with us. We'll talk about his book, Courageous, which is a great book, even if we weren't in the midst of needing some courage, in the midst of some fear and concern and anxiety. And so we'll talk with him a little bit about what their church has been doing and also how we can take some of these principles, primarily from the book of Joshua, being courageous and understanding the set of circumstances we are in, like the sons of Issachar and others. It's a great book. I think it will, again, be something we'll talk about for about a half an hour. But each time then we'll open up and the last half hour of each of those hours to, first of all, talk about some of the news that we have and, most importantly, take some of the phone calls that you like to provide for us as well. With that as background, just before we take a break, I will quote from our friend Jim Dennison. He's been on the program with us many times before, that we do have a deal. And, of course, the votes are coming today, and it will be, indeed, a deal, a historic $2 trillion. Now, again, when we say $1 trillion, it's kind of hard to get a handle on it. $2 trillion would be 2,000 billion. Okay, does that help you understand? Or 2 billion, however one you want to, 2 billion. I mean, you can, or million. You can start recognizing we're talking about enormous amounts of money. We did not have a $1 trillion deficit until Ronald Reagan was president, and we did not have a $1 trillion budget until, I think there was the first one, Bill Clinton, or certainly George W. Bush. And so you can see we're talking about borrowing money from the future, printing money in order to even provide this. And, of course, the full vote in the Senate will take place today. And because of reaching an agreement, the stock market yesterday had its best day since 1933. It surged more than 2,100 points. So very significant. And since I'm mentioning our good friend Jim Dennison, he quotes from George Freeman, and we've been wanting to get George Freeman on. It's been a while since we've had him on. But in a recent column, George Freeman broke down kind of the four aspects of what we need to pay attention to: medical, economic, social, and political. The medical system is seeking to limit the disease, the infections, and the deaths. Because at the moment we have no cures, but we do have some things that are looking better, so we'll talk about that. Then the social issue is, of course, the supplies, the equipment, the tests, and those kinds of things. Since, again, the disease appears to be spread primarily through human contact, the medical system needs to address the social part of that as well. The third, of course, are the economic systems, because George Freeman says much of the economy cannot be sustained with social distancing. And we're, of course, seeing dire warnings right now about industries such as the airlines that could collapse. And then finally, the political system seeking to deal with some of those economic realities as well. So we have, or will be posting shortly, the daily article from Jim Dennison that reminds us that this is a $2 trillion stimulus deal. And when we come back from the break, what I want to do is, first of all, talk about what's not in it. One of the articles we're going to post here as well is what's called the 1,400-page coronavirus relief boondoggle, some of the things that were in that particular report. I'll give you kind of a brief summary of a few of those things and then go into a few of the details. Try not to wear you out, but at the same time, we simply can see that there is this philosophy that simply says, never let a serious crisis go to waste. And that is certainly the case, where up until, I think, about Saturday night, the Senate had a deal. Chuck Schumer was talking about how this was a wonderful bipartisan agreement. And then the far left showed up. Nancy Pelosi showed up, and we had all sorts of attempts to put all sorts of new ornaments on this Christmas tree that they were going to pass. Fortunately, most of those did not make it into the final bill, but we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
By now, you've probably received an envelope in the mail that says United States Census 2020. You're supposed to go online and fill it out before April 1st. There are many reasons why you should do so. The most important reason is the fact that the census count will determine how many representatives you will have in the future. The state you're living in has changed significantly in the last 10 years when the last census was taken. Those changing numbers will be used by your state legislature in 2021 to redraw the lines for Congress, the state legislature, the State Board of Education, and various courts. The Census Bureau is required to get the data to state legislatures by this time next year, but the hope is that it will arrive earlier. Then the process of drawing these lines will begin. How that is done varies from state to state. Legislators draw lines in most states, while commissions draw lines in others. As you might imagine, Democratic legislators would like the lines drawn so there are potentially more Democratic districts. Republicans would like boundaries drawn so that more Republicans could be elected. There are other issues to consider. For example, most state laws require districts to follow county lines whenever that is possible. Sometimes numerous counties must be bunched together in areas with low population density. Citizens would like to keep cities, towns, and school districts together. Getting all of that in a single district is sometimes difficult. Add to that the requirement from the Voting Rights Act that require boundaries assure that anyone has the right to vote based on race, ethnicity, and language group. And this law has also provided a context for bringing numerous lawsuits against states once the maps are drawn. In order to start this process, you need to fill out the census. Then you need to express your views about the drawing of districts for the next decade. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, one of the things you learn if you ever take a class in political science or government is the term log rolling. So I thought I would put that one on the table today. And what does log rolling means? Basically, it was a term developed back, I think, at least in the 19th century, may even go back to the 18th century. But it was the idea that, okay, I will do this for you in my bill if you do this for me in my bill. And so it's kind of getting the logs rolling down the hill. And so I am not naive enough to expect that we would get a clean bill out of Congress. Figured that out. There are going to be people on the Democratic side of the aisle that are going to get pressure from union groups, environmental groups, feminist, pro-abortion groups. Got that. There are going to be people on the Republican side that are going to get pressure from maybe pro-life groups, pro-family groups, but also the Chamber of Commerce, K-State, or K-Street lawyers. Got it. So, you know, sometimes even when we try to pass a bill, there are all sorts of people that want to put ornaments on the Christmas tree. But what happened this weekend and over the last couple of days have shocked even the most jaded people in Washington, D.C., because as I mentioned before we went to the break, everybody thought we had a deal between the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate, between Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. And then it all blew up. And in large part, it had to do with when Nancy Pelosi came back to Washington, D.C., and Katie Pavlich talks about the fact that all of a sudden you have all sorts of racial identity material that they want to put in there, trying to determine, for example, the race and racial statistics of anybody on the corporate boards. Wanted to bail out the post office. What that has to do with the coronavirus, I do not know. Of course, they want to do all sorts of things in terms of voting, require early voting in all states, require same-day voting registration. And this is Cloward-Piven kind of stuff, which we've talked about here before. All sorts of provisions on union collective bargaining. Then they just went after the airlines in an incredible way, wanted to require complete carbon offsets for the airlines by 2025 and complete reporting of the greenhouse gas statistics for airlines, which, as I heard one commentator point out, is impossible because that changes from day to day, whether you have headwinds or tailwinds, whether you have a lot of people on the plane or you don't have a lot of people. I mean, it would have just been a nightmare, not to mention mandated federal $15 an hour minimum wage, permanent paid leave, and on and on and on. And so to go into that in more detail, we have posted a piece that came out in National Review that reminds you of the fact that there was always this idea that let's never let a crisis go to waste. And interestingly enough, sometimes people even more recently are making that statement. The majority whip from South Carolina, Jim Clyburn, actually said that this is a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. So it is very obvious that it was like, look, we can't get any of this passed in Congress, but when we get a piece of legislation that is a must-pass piece of legislation that both the House and the Senate have to pass, and we know that we can put a gun to the head of some of these representatives and senators and ultimately to the president, we can insert as much in there as we can so that we will then eventually be able to enact the agenda we've always wanted to enact. And if nothing else, this gives you a little bit of an idea if indeed when you have a Democrat president, a democratically controlled House and Senate, what they would like to do, because they, for example, wanted to amend the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act. That one came out in 1989 due to the crisis there, to actually increase the number of minorities and women in various banks. They wanted to establish a minority bank deposit program. They wanted a lot more diversity reporting and make sure that more and more people with different kinds of diversity, and that was everything from racial to gender to even physical disability. They wanted to restructure the corporate boards, which we talked about just a minute ago. They wanted to amend the Help America Vote Act to require states to actually have same-day voter registration. Now, what could possibly go wrong with that? Then on immigration, I didn't mention that before, they wanted to prohibit institutions of higher learning from disclosing the immigration status of the students. In other words, you couldn't even report that. Of course, all of this has so much to do with, of course, coronavirus. Then they wanted to deinstitutionalize all sorts of things like this. You have a program which has the money follows a person program in Medicaid, but they wanted to reauthorize that so it follows the person and all of the rest. And then, of course, I mentioned the aviation regulations. I'm trying not to wear you out because this goes on for pages. But let me just mention those. They wanted to actually have a grant program that would be devoted to environmental protections. A sustainable aviation fuel development program would be part of that. And then mandatory carbon offsets for airlines, and the list goes on. And if you think that I have given you the complete list, I would encourage you to go to our website right now, pointofview.net. You can find the 1,400-page coronavirus relief boondoggle put forward by Nancy Pelosi. And, of course, you will hear that the president doesn't care about people because he didn't implement some of these vital aspects of the program. But maybe you heard here on Point of View how many of these ideas had nothing to do with coronavirus, nothing to do with COVID-19. The good news is there are some things in the bill that really need to be in the bill. Let me just pick out a few before we take a break. First of all, business loans and forgiveness for businesses that have faced a major interruption because we are telling so many of these businesses to actually close down because they have employees that have been told to stay home. And some individuals certainly can work from home and can telecommute. But imagine if you have a factory. I have a friend, for example, that has a factory where they're producing all sorts of equipment for oil production. Maybe they're allowing them to keep up there, but if maybe you're producing something that looks like a widget that isn't seen as an essential industry, and all the equipment, all the dyes and everything else are in the factory, and most people at home can't do anything when they're not there. So far, the act provides about $300 billion. That's a lot of money, by the way, in loans. And businesses could receive a maximum of 2.5 months' worth of payroll costs, up to a maximum of $10 million. So that gives them the opportunity to continue paying some of their workers, even when they aren't producing a product or not producing a service, which would actually provide a benefit to those particular businesses and corporations. Number two, there's a real incentive to rehire some of those workers that you've had to lay off. And those employers receive credits, they receive loan forgiveness, and a variety of other things, so that's going to be helpful. They also, of course, have rebates, which will go to you if you are listening right now. They're talking about cash payments of $1,200 per individual, $2,400 for a married couple, plus an additional benefit for children up to people with incomes up to $75,000 for individuals, $150,000 for married couples. And then, of course, one of the most significant, which we've mentioned before, delayed tax filings. That's important for you as an individual because maybe you had to get your taxes in by April 15th. Now you have that to push back to July 15th. But that's also helpful for the businesses who find themselves saying, wait a minute, I'm supposed to, what? Get my taxes in when the accountant or the bookkeeper in my office is at home, doesn't have access to all of those records. You can see where that actually is a very significant issue as well. And then one last one I'll just mention, the act provides up to about $500 billion or $500 billion to businesses or to states and municipalities for losses that they've incurred, especially those which would jeopardize a business operation. And so when you are hearing so many people saying, well, this is just a corporate bailout, interestingly enough, there are some great supports for workers that that have small number of employees, but actually there's nothing for workers of large employers. So actually, if you go back and look at the way this is crafted, it is going to spend a fair amount of time really trying to help small businesses, and also about $400 billion for the Federal Reserve in terms of lending. So those are some elements in the bill which deserve to be in the bill. And if nothing else, thank your member of Congress for some of the things that did not deserve to be in the bill, but Nancy Pelosi and some of the Democratic leadership wanted to put in the bill. And when we come back, let's, if we can, talk about some of the misinformation about the coronavirus coming, interesting enough, from a number of politicians. We'll talk about that right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, just before we talk about some of the misinformation, let's talk about something positive, at least, a matter of fact, very surprising. When would you think that somebody with the name Biden would be working with somebody by the name of Trump? Okay, it isn't necessarily Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but it's close enough. And that is a piece in terms of one of the articles that we have posted here, a bipartisan effort underway to hold Chinese government financially accountable for the coronavirus outbreak. And what it is a law firm advised by the younger brother of the former Vice President Joe Biden, has actually partnered with a lobbying shop which has connections with President Donald Trump to push for a federal class action lawsuit. And what they're doing is seeking to hold the government of China accountable for the economic carnage that actually has taken place. Now, again, if you're not familiar with that, we've covered that before. I have a commentary coming out next week. And matter of fact, before the hour's up, maybe I'll go through that one more time. But it is very clear that when we talk about China, that on a number of occasions they were well aware of the problem and simply allowed the problem to fester, even at a time when they finally were reporting that we are going to take very significant actions. They were still denying that it was taking place through human transmission, which of course it was. They went ahead and allowed them to have the Chinese Lunar Year celebration, which probably caused an even greater outbreak. And to this day, I'm not sure we can trust the numbers. The other day, I posted a piece that showed the various graphs for China and many other countries, and it showed that China, in terms of the number of cumulative outbreaks, was starting to level off, as we were looking for it to do. And one of the first people to post on my Facebook pointed out that I don't trust anything from China, and then posted a piece pointing out that there are millions of phones in China that have gone dead. Now think about this. You could either assume that some of these people in this disruption lost their phone or couldn't pay their bill, and so it just simply went dead because the phones are not being used. Or you could assume, I think more reasonably, that the phones are dead because the people that own the phones are dead. And if that number is even close, it recognizes that there is a remarkable unreporting, completely lack of reporting from China. So we don't know. But that being said, if nothing else, this lawsuit is one that has been filed, and it's an attempt, really kind of a bipartisan approach to address this issue. Let's get a couple of quotes here from one of the individuals who is with the Berman Law Group. He said, "We believe that this is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is an American issue. The best way to do this is a bipartisan effort to hold China accountable." He went on to then say, "Anyone who is willing to participate and help, we plan to work with or to help move this lawsuit forward to collect the citizens of the United States for this terrible tragedy that has happened." One of the other comments comes from the Lucas Compton group, and that's Travis Lucas himself, and he said, "We should be unified in our response and our strategy about how we manage and navigate the situation with the government of China. The government of China needs to be held accountable, not only to its people, but also to the rest of the world." So I might just mention that particular piece of information is, if you think about it, rather encouraging, that we could actually get something that approximates kind of a bipartisan action. And, of course, there are all sorts of other reasons for hope. Going back to the piece by Jim Dennison, he points out, as we've talked about before, that there is some preliminary evidence, more anecdotal evidence, that warm, humid weather will slow the virus. Now, I talked about this the other day with the research that was done statistically by John Lott, doing a comparison between northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere is in summer right now, and also now there's a new study that's just come out. Again, these are all preliminary, but it shows that the growth rate for the virus in places like New York has been much more aggressive than the growth rate, for example, in, say, Georgia or Texas or places like, or even Southern California. So maybe that's good news, and then the hot weather can't come fast enough if indeed that is the case. And, of course, we have a number of medicines going through trial, so we'll see where that takes us. But just before we take a break, I wanted to take on another issue, and that is in the midst of misinformation, some created by conspiratorial theorists, some misinformation apparently now coming from those who are trying to bring down this country, those who hate this country. And we could talk about Russian hackers, and we can talk about the Chinese and all the rest. There is quite a number of examples of the individual who may now indeed be running against Donald Trump in the general election, the former Vice President Joe Biden, who seems to be pushing misinformation. So Peter Hasson with the Daily Caller has put together 5 of these examples, and these aren't just hypothetical. Many of these, interestingly enough, have already started showing up in some of these Twitter posts, will probably show up in campaign ads, and are one of the reasons why we talked about the other day the concern about this kind of dark money issue, because not only are they being expressed by the former vice president, but they're being used in various kinds of attack ads against the president. Now, you want to attack the president for his opinion? Go for it. The president says he is convinced that we might be over this by Easter. It's an opinion. I think it's wrong, but it's an opinion, and you certainly can take that on. Everybody's allowed their opinion, but they're not allowed to have their own facts, and this is a very different kind of set of circumstances. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 1, Joe Biden has falsely claimed that Donald Trump and the Trump administration sliced the CDC budget. We've talked about that before. This is something that has been criticized not only by the Trump administration, but by almost every fact checker that's looked into this. Last week, I mentioned, of course, there was a full-page op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post to try to argue that this was a false rumor, and it was not wrong in any way, shape, or form. But again, you don't have to take the Trump administration for it. You don't have to take an individual that had worked for the Bush administration or had worked for the Obama administration. The AP in their fact check said they're both wrong to say the agencies have seen their money cut. End of discussion. Number 2, former Vice President Joe Biden falsely claimed that Donald Trump rejected the World Health Organization tests. And interestingly enough, if you can even look at PolitiFact, it said the World Health Organization never offered to sell tests and kits to the United States. And so this is a claim that doesn't even have any basis because they weren't offering them in the first place. Number 3, this one is now in a Trump video, actually a Biden video against Trump, I should say. And that is the Biden campaign falsely claimed that Donald Trump called the virus a hoax. Again, we've talked about this before, but let me come into it as well. And that is simply the idea that when he was talking about this, he was talking about the attempt by the media hoax to try to make it sound worse than it really was. And again, let's go to PolitiFact, which again is more of a left-leaning kind of fact checker. They said the video makes it seem like Trump is calling the disease itself a hoax, which he hasn't done. The words are Trump's, but the editing by Biden is false. As a matter of fact, in order to do that, somebody was actually calculating I think it's like more than 100 words you had to take out of the clip in order to make that one work. But let's go on before we take a break, a couple more. Biden's campaign falsely accused Trump of silencing CDC officials. And again, that one doesn't make a great deal of sense. If for no other reason, then we've had the officials that themselves have said, nobody's ever tried to actually silence me. I've had an opportunity at the coronavirus task force to say anything I want, and I've been allowed to say anything I want at any press conference. And then finally, number 5, Biden falsely said he hasn't criticized the president's coronavirus response. That one really does not pass the straight face test, because look at all the criticism we just mentioned. Yet, nevertheless, former Vice President Joe Biden on The View on Tuesday said he has not criticized Donald Trump on the coronavirus. And then, of course, you can pull out all sorts of tweets. Let me just pull out one in the interest of time since we're coming to a break. This tweet by Joe Biden: Donald Trump is wholly unfit to lead this nation, and that has become even clearer in the last few days. So, if nothing else, I can't even take that one seriously. But those are just a couple of examples of misinformation. And sadly, I'm afraid that's going to be a preview of coming attractions. You're going to see more and more claims. Some of these claims, by the way, have merited 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post, but I think you can see that none of them seem to have substance. We'll come back and talk about the economic issues right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention as well that in the next hour, I'm going to spend about a half an hour from Scott Sauls, and his book is entitled A Gentle Answer, Our Secret Weapon in an Age of Us Against Them. Many of the studies show that Americans are angrier than ever before. And sadly, sometimes Christians are no exception to that. So we're going to try to focus some time and attention on that. He said, for our generation, hate has been commodified and outrage has been turned into an asset. Instead of getting rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, as Scripture urges us to do, we form entire communities around our irritations and hatreds. But Jesus gave us a resource that enables us to walk on the same boldness that he exhibited. So we're going to talk about the need for a gentle answer, and especially as I talk about some of these things that, quite frankly, are somewhat outrageous. We do need to get that. And then we're going to spend some time going into a little more of the facts. I haven't really covered what's happening around the nation, but I want to give a little bit of understanding of the hard look, as Jim Garrity points out, on the remaining hospital capacity. And so we're going to kind of hopscotch around various places in the country on our national hour and talk about where we are there. Also focusing a lot of attention for a few minutes, as we have in one of the articles we posted, on what's happening in New York. And it also, I think, illustrates a point that I'll get to real quickly. There's been a real controversy over the last less than 24 hours now when the county judge of Collin County, Chris Hill, who I happen to know and voted for and even had signs in my yard promoting him, took a little different tack than what, of course, Clay Jenkins, who is the judge of Dallas County, did. And yet I think you have to understand that things are very different around the country. If you get a top-down answer, well, there are just a lot of differences between, say, downtown New York City and upstate New York. There's a real difference between Dallas and Amarillo, or a difference between Collin County and just pick one of the county, maybe Antelope, Texas, or something like that, because when they say, well, we need social distancing, some of the people in West Texas are going to say, we've been practicing social distancing for, I don't know, centuries out here. There's just nobody out here. So to have this one-size-fits-all answer doesn't work very well. And, of course, New York City is suffering because of the fact that it is such a cosmopolitan area, because there's such density, and because so many people have flown in and out of LaGuardia and Kennedy. So we'll talk about some of that as well. But a lot of people are saying, what's going to happen economically? And this piece is something I thought I would talk about for just a minute. We'll get into it more in the next hour. But in Pennsylvania, for example, already they've had 350,000 first-time claims for unemployment assistance. So you can see why we would need this largest rescue package in the history of America. If you want to put that in some kind of situation, you can say that usually over the entire country, you're lucky if you have 200,000 first-time claims of unemployment, and this one is just in one state, the Keystone State. And so, of course, the impact on the economy could be significant. Last Friday, Goldman Sachs estimated that the U.S. GDP probably will be a negative 24% in the second quarter, which I thought was interesting. Now, again, some of the economists tend to be very optimistic and believe that eventually, maybe in the third quarter, it will increase. But I don't know where they're coming up with that right now. They're hoping that it would recover by maybe 12% in the third quarter. I don't know. We'll see. And, of course, the argument is that unemployment might peak at 9%. Well, we'll see. But nevertheless, that is the case, because what really drives the economy, which we've talked about on this program before, is consumer spending. About 70% of GDP is consumer spending. Let me ask you a question. How much have you been spending lately? Well, maybe you bought some things on Amazon. Maybe you have gone through some drive-thrus, but I suspect a lot of you aren't going out there and buying clothes right now. You're not walking in the malls, all sorts of things. So you can see how that's having a real significant issue. And let's just go down the road a little bit. I've oftentimes said that for every person worried about the end of the world, there's 1,000 people worried about the end of the month. Okay, I want to look long range. Let's look down months from now. Maybe we finally get to the point where all the people who are furloughed or have been fired come back. Well, they're not going to come back in the same situation they were 3 weeks ago, right? Because they will have drained their savings. They've gone deeper into debt. And, of course, that is the case. And you might say, well, maybe they'd start traveling again. Well, you can begin to think about that. The airlines are recognizing, there was an airplane the other day. There's one guy on the airplane, a Southwest Airlines flight. He's the only person on the airplane. Well, even after we eventually say we're safe, and I'm not sure when that comes anytime soon, how many people are going to want to venture out and go on the next air flight out? You can think that's going to be an issue as well. So back to the key point. There have been some that have said this is going to be like a V. We have this crash, and then it comes up like the other side of the V. But already many people are saying that just may be an illusion. It may be more like a poorly drawn U that eventually will increase over time. We can look down the road. But even as we get back to something that looks like normal, normal won't be quite what we thought it was going to be. And, of course, right now, we recognize that there are a number of people that are already hurting because, as I have a commentary coming out next week, the survey that was done this last year with Bankrate asked Americans that if you just had to pay for a $1,000 unexpected expense, would you be able to do so? 60% said nope. 40% said yes. They had enough in savings that they could deal with a $1,000 expense. That could be an emergency room visit. It could be a car repair, whatever. And that, by the way, is something that's been validated in other surveys from 2014 to 2018. So we're seeing the same numbers in various surveys that have been taken. So what about the other 60%? Well, more than a third would say they'd have to borrow money. And that would either be from a credit card or through personal loans from a family or friends. About 14% say they might reduce spending on other things. And as I mentioned just the other day, you know, most Americans have a smartphone, and most Americans have a flat screen, high-definition television. A majority of Americans dine out at least once a week, and a significant percentage dine out 3 or more times a week. So maybe they could squeeze a little bit out. But you can begin to see that even if they receive that $1,200 government check, that's still not going to bring about the kind of relief that needs to take place. And so I think you can at least understand and give the president partial credit for wanting to say, let's hope that all of this is over by Easter. I don't think there's any reason to believe that. But if that is the case, then that V actually will take place. I think we're talking about a very long, extended U before we see the growth in the economy, and then maybe even a hesitation on the part of some individuals before consumer spending picks back up. And if 70% of the economy is due to consumer spending, you can see that that is an issue that is affecting the economy right now. And so we'll see where we go. Largest rescue package in the history of this country. Might do some good for a while, but we still may be in it for the long haul, so we'll see. Let me, if I can, encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. Caught a number of articles that we have posted, including my Viewpoints piece, which reminds you that as you're sitting at home, if you haven't filled out your census report, you need to do so, because next year we will be redrawing new districts, congressional districts, legislative districts, judicial districts, and it will be really important for them to get the accurate information that you need to file with them right now. Let's take a break. When we come back, Scott Sauls will be with us. It'll be a great conversation about the need for us to have a gentle answer, which I think turns away wrath. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time going back and forth. We're going to get some biblical teaching. In just a minute, we'll be talking about this new book, A Gentle Answer, in a generation which is now sort of commodified, outraged, and even turned it into an asset, which is one of the opening statements in the book. We need to think about how we can exercise civility, recognize that a gentle answer turns away wrath. So we'll be talking about that. But then a little bit later this hour, I want to get into the fact that the White House, Senate, and the House are actually reaching a deal, and we will then have a deal on the largest rescue package in the history of this nation. So we'll talk about what that might mean. And then also there's a bipartisan attempt to hold the Chinese government accountable. You'll be able to read those articles on the website. And then a little bit later, I want to try to maybe hopscotch around the country and give you a report from a variety of different states on what various health experts are saying are the challenges being faced in some of these hospitals. Where, of course, New York is one of the big focus, but California, we're going to look at Alabama, we'll look at Georgia, Texas, New Mexico, Oregon, Colorado, Connecticut, Maine, just to mention a few. And so we'll look at that. And then also just ask some questions about some of the economic impacts. So there's a lot that we will be covering. But in this first half hour, I wanted to spend some time welcoming back to the microphone Scott Sauls, who is the senior pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church right there in Nashville, Tennessee. He is also one of the co-founding pastors of the Nashville Institute for Faith and Work. You might remember when we had him on last time talking about Jesus Outside the Lines, and we're talking about this new book. It is a Thomas Nelson book entitled A Gentle Answer, Our Secret Weapon in an Age of Us Against Them. Scott, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me again, Kerby. It's good to be back with you.
Let's, if we can, get into that issue, because you start right off with a interesting quote, which I thought was so interesting. John Perkins said, "This generation is the first to turn hate into an asset." I'd not heard that till I read your book, but it's one of the reasons for your book, isn't it?
Yes. It's a reality. I think that you don't really need do a whole lot of convincing is out there, that there's a lot of us against them happening in the different conversations in society and even inside the broader church. I think the big word, the buzzword these days is polarization.
Right.
There's a lot of polarization and people having a harder time getting along and a harder time doing grace and kindness and civility well. And, I think that it's a especially unique opportunity for Christian people to contribute something different and something more life-giving to a culture that seems to be turning in on itself.
200-page book, and really broken down into two sections. The gentleness that Jesus has for us. He befriends the sinner in us, he reforms the Pharisee in us, and he disarms the cynic in us. And then part two, how his gentleness changes us. We grow thicker skin, We do anger well. We receive criticism graciously. We forgive all the way, and we bless our own betrayers. And so the first part is something that I'm sure you probably have had a chance to maybe talk about in your own church and preach about. I might just mention that in addition to maybe reading this individually, at the end of each chapter, you have questions for reflection and discussion. So, Scott, I would certainly assume that if some of our listeners say, this is a problem, we have even a divided church on some of this, things are politicized entirely too much, and we all seem to be retreating into our tribes, this would be a good small group study as well, wouldn't it?
Well, that's certainly part of the idea, is to get groups of people having conversations around these things. And, in my ideal world, what I would love to see is people who don't see eye to eye on this or that can actually come together and have sort of a, be quick to listen and slow to speak conversation about polarization and how, especially people of faith can contribute to a different way, even of having differences and working through differences. But yeah, it's a book that can be read by individuals, by small groups, and even entire churches and ministry groups.
Yeah.
Designed for that kind of flexibility. So.
Sure. One of the examples that you use in there, I love that, is because it's with at that time, Congressman-elect, but now, of course, elected in the 2nd Congressional District, just down the road from where we are broadcasting today, Dan Crenshaw. And when on Saturday Night Live, the comedian Pete Davidson made a joke about him, the response from Dan Crenshaw was one that allowed him to then go on to Saturday Night Live, and instead of building a barrier, instead of reacting to that, decided to build a bridge. And so in some respects, we've got a good contemporary example that happened right there.
Yeah, there are plenty of examples, and I try to share several of them in the book. But yeah, that particular story, which some of your listeners, those who watch Saturday Night Live or who may have followed that story in other ways, it's just one example of how you can take even a situation in which you're being attacked, a situation in which you're being maybe made fun of or made a spectacle of, and what Dan Crenshaw did. And as I understand it, Dan Crenshaw is a believer and came from that place of being a man of faith, and he assumed a very generous posture toward Pete, and reached out to him privately and expressed how much appreciation he has for Pete Davidson's father, who died as, I think, a fireman in the 9/11 cleanup, and just reached out in kindness to somebody who had, I guess, spoken harshly to him or about him. And through that experience, it ended up a situation where Dan Crenshaw was invited on to Saturday Night Live. They made a little bit of a joke out of it, but also kind of did a public reconciliation with each other. And then when they thought the camera was turned off and they thought that they'd gone to commercial break, Pete Davidson leans over to Dan Crenshaw and on national television and says, "Hey, you're a really good man." And so I think it's a great picture of what the Proverbs say, that a gentle answer does turn away wrath. A gentle answer is it can accomplish so much if it's done in a healthy way.
Sure. Let's take a break. And Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath. And we've certainly been talking about some contemporary examples. But what can we learn from the life of Jesus as he confronted individuals that were criticizing him and attacking him? And how can we apply that so that we aren't Pharisees, we aren't cynics, but if nothing else, we receive even criticism graciously? We'll continue our conversation with Pastor Scott Sauls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
By now, you've probably received an envelope in the mail that says United States Census 2020. You're supposed to go online and fill it out before April 1st. There are many reasons why you should do so. The most important reason is the fact that the census count will determine how many representatives you will have in the future. The state you're living in has changed significantly in the last 10 years when the last census was taken. Those changing numbers will be used by your state legislature in 2021 to redraw the lines for Congress, the state legislature, the State Board of Education, and various courts. The Census Bureau is required to get the data to state legislatures by this time next year, but the hope is that it will arrive earlier. Then the process of drawing these lines will begin. How that is done varies from state to state. Legislators draw lines in most states, while commissions draw lines in others. As you might imagine, Democratic legislators would like the lines drawn so there are potentially more Democratic districts. Republicans would like boundaries drawn so that more Republicans could be elected. There are other issues to consider. For example, most state laws require districts to follow county lines whenever that is possible. Sometimes numerous counties must be bunched together in areas with low population density. Citizens would like to keep cities, towns, and school districts together. Getting all of that in a single district is sometimes difficult. Add to that the requirement from the Voting Rights Act that require boundaries assure that anyone has the right to vote based on race, ethnicity, and language group. And this law has also provided a context for bringing numerous lawsuits against states once the maps are drawn. In order to start this process, you need to fill out the census. Then you need to express your views about the drawing of districts for the next decade. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Scott Sauls, and again, we'll let him get on to his day, but I thought you would love to know about this book, A Gentle Answer, Our Secret Weapon in an Age of Us versus Them. How many times have we talked about the need for civility? We have actually had programs that have focused on that. There have been people on this program that have encouraged you to go out there and buy coffee for somebody that maybe you disagree with and develop a relationship. So this book is just going to be another great resource for you. And I think if you are involved in a small group or a Bible fellowship or small group teaching or maybe even a Sunday school class, maybe even if you're a pastor, this is just great material that you can benefit from. And Scott, just before I go on, since you are a pastor, I'd just love to know what you are doing right now at Christ Presbyterian Church, because I suspect, like a lot of pastors, you've had to work with all sorts of electronic media to connect up with your members in the congregation.
Yeah, so we're doing a couple of things. One is that we're, like a lot of other churches, live streaming our services on Sunday. It's been a pretty interesting adjustment to preach to an empty sanctuary, but yes. We've ironically had higher attendance than we ever have in the history of our church of people dialing in, and so it's been a very interesting dynamic there of just making our worship service a resource online to our people and to locals and anybody else who doesn't have a church already to dial into is welcome to join us for that. But outside of that, we're doing all of our staff meetings using Zoom, which is a platform that can be used on a computer or on a handheld device where you can get as many people as you want to in a meeting together, and all of their faces appear in front of you. It's on your screen. It's pretty remarkable. And so we've been able to have several staff meetings. We're encouraging our small groups to meet in that way, and a lot of them are doing that for small group Bible study and prayer. And so it's this whole new world of connection that's being opened up to us during a time where we're separated from each other in order to prevent the virus from spreading. So
sure.
It's been a very interesting time for sure.
It for certainly is. And anybody been out on Facebook seen the meme where it says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, a Zoom server is there among them." And so we're all using some of the new technology now in a way to connect. Right. Let's just, before we run out of time, talk about a couple of things. First of all, one of the things in your book, one of the very significant sections, was the pride of the scribes and Pharisees. There is a tendency, Scott, for us when we look at the scribes and Pharisees to say, oh, yeah, that's the way they were, and not to make the connection. That can be how we are. And one of the arguments you make in one of your chapters is Jesus helps reform the Pharisee in us, doesn't he?
Yes. I mean, that's really the starting point of becoming the kinds of people that we're called to be in the less civil spaces that God places us in, is to deal with our own hearts first. And of course, that starts with remembering and recognizing and embracing how Christ came to us and demonstrated his love toward us, not when we were friendly to him, but when we were his enemies, as Romans 5:8 says. While we were still sinners, while we were still opposed to him, that's when Christ died for us. And that's our basis, and that's our resource for gentleness and a kind demeanor. When we're holding that in our hearts, obviously it makes us more tender people and less self-righteous and more humble and better equipped to offer a gentle answer when called for. But I want to be clear, too, that a gentle answer doesn't mean becoming a doormat. There's a whole chapter on legitimate, appropriate, righteous anger.
Right.
Christianity doesn't say don't be angry. It says in your anger, don't sin. There are certain things that Christians ought to be upset about when the weak and vulnerable are being attacked or oppressed or overlooked, or the poor are being neglected, or women are being abused, or children are being abused and hurt. There are all sorts of reasons why Christians ought to be upset. We ought to be upset and angry about this virus that's wreaking such havoc around the world, in the same way that Jesus was angry at death when his friend Lazarus in John 11 had been buried for a few days. He got angry at death before he rose the man from death. And so I want to be clear that anger and love can go together, and anger and kindness and anger and gentleness can go together. We just need to be healthy in our expressions of both.
And a lot of this is really going back to, if you will, the golden rule. Love your enemies just as you've been loved. Treat others as you would like to be treated. You have chapters, like you said, on to do anger well, but also to receive criticism graciously. Sometimes that criticism is unfair, but if it's fair and it is going to be helpful, that is the case. And most importantly, I guess, as we kind of wind this down for this half hour, it really is about building a bridge. There are times when certainly we can't build a bridge because individuals have criticized us unfairly, when they are mean-spirited and they are coming after us. But whenever possible, we should provide an opportunity to build a bridge at a time when we have such a divided country. As you point out, there are surveys that show that, yes, Americans are probably more divided and angrier than ever, but oftentimes Christians themselves are a good example of that. So we need to live differently, be countercultural in what we say and do, and that's really kind of the theme of the book, isn't it?
It is. And if I may say so, I think that one of Christians' greatest opportunity for faithful, effective, persuasive witness right now is this. In a culture where outrage is everywhere, and everybody seems to be looking for something to be offended by. We so easily feel wronged, and we so easily identify ourselves as the victims of this or that, and that's just kind of the general tone everywhere. What would it look like for believers in Christ everywhere to retreat from that kind of posture and instead respond proactively as people who love our neighbors and who are proactive in the way that we love our neighbors and proactive in the way that we that we forgive, and proactive in the way that we speak kindly, not only toward people that agree with us, but also and especially toward people who don't agree with us. It seems like that was the pattern of Christ. He was a friend of sinners. He welcomed sinners and eats with them, and that got him criticized plenty. But Jesus was not shy about who he would reach out to and be kind to, including prostitutes and tax collectors and gluttons and drunks, so much so that the religious establishment accused him of being a glutton and a drunk because he was so kind to gluttons and drunks. Even though he wasn't one himself, he was so kind to people that religious people were used to just judging and punishing and excluding. And so what would it look like for the whole Church of Jesus Christ to sort of reassume that vision and that posture toward our neighbor instead of being defensive and snippy?
And that, again, is
that's what I'd love to see.
That, to me, is a great way, and we have such a great opportunity for testimony. Let me also encourage our listeners to go to scottsauls.com, because your most recent piece on fearing the future, if we, in the midst of a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, and fear, show confidence, we certainly, I think, in some respects, can really stand out in our culture as well. So this book isn't out yet, but I just wanted you to know about that, and you can order an advance copy of the book, and maybe later on when it's out and making an impact, we'll talk about it again. But I just thought it was so appropriate in light of what we're all going through. So you can go to the website, pointofview.net. You can find scottsauls.com there and find his blog, and you can find out more about the book, which will be out in the future. And I just appreciate you giving us a little bit of an update on what's happening right there at Christ Presbyterian Church. And thank you for your service, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Very kind of you to have me again.
We will do it again. As a matter of fact, when the book is actually published, we probably will. But I wanted to give you kind of an advance notice, because some of these books come out, and it just seems so appropriate to be talking about a book before it's actually been published, and you can go and order it for yourself. We come back. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend some time talking about this relief rescue package, the most expensive one in the history of this nation. I might spend a little bit of time talking about what isn't in it. That's all the stuff that Nancy Pelosi wanted to stick in it, but fortunately most of it is not. Then what are some of the things that are in it? Then we're going to talk about this idea of this bipartisan approach from a man by the name of Biden. No, not Joe Biden, but Joe Biden's, interesting enough, younger brother, and the Trump administration. Didn't see that one coming. And then we'll get into a couple of other topics as well. We've got a lot to cover. We will do so right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
For about half hour, let's, if we can, talk about some of the aspect and the news on the coronavirus. But in particular, let's start off by looking at what I think could easily be described as the largest rescue package in American history. We're talking about $2 trillion. And again, sometimes it's hard to get those numbers in your head. $2 trillion is $2,000 billion. In other words, imagine $1 billion and then have that stack of $1 billion and then have 2,000 stacks of that. That gives you a little bit of an idea of the enormous amount of money that is here. And in just a minute, I'll talk about what's not in it, which I'm glad. Some of the things that Nancy Pelosi wanted to put on as ornaments on this Christmas tree, and then what some of the positive aspects of this might be, but also some of the great challenges we face. One of the articles I've posted here is our good friend Jim Dennison, who refers to this, that, again, even the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called it the largest rescue package in American history. Then the Senate, of course, is going to vote on it today. Probably already have. I haven't really been able to watch that. And because of reaching an agreement, the stock market yesterday had its best day since 1933, surging more than 2,100 points. Some of the global markets are soaring as well. So that's all good news in that sense. But it is not good news in terms of running up a national debt, and maybe I'll get to that a little bit later. But as we've pointed out before, it looked like there was going to be a deal days ago. Matter of fact, on late Saturday night, you had the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer say that this was one of the best bipartisan various kinds of negotiations they had. And so it seemed like there was agreement between the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And then Nancy Pelosi came into town and everything changed. And all of a sudden they started talking about the fact that, well, we want information about how these corporate boards are put together. We want statistics on their race, their gender, all sorts of issues. We want to now bail out the Postal Service. We want to maybe change some of the laws and rules and regulations having to do with voting. Not only require early voting in every state, but also require same-day voter registration. Oh, what could go wrong there? Then various provisions for collective bargaining. Then it began to be critical of the airlines in terms of trying to force the airlines to have all sorts of carbon offsets and even have reporting on the so-called greenhouse gases for individual flights. When it tried to implement a $15 an hour minimum wage, permanent paid leave, and on and on. So one of the articles I've posted for you is that, if nothing else, is a list from that 1,400-page kind of coronavirus relief boondoggle by Nancy Pelosi, and you can read it in its entirety, but a lot of it has to do with various diversity initiatives, which have nothing to do with the coronavirus, the restructuring of corporate boards, which, again, only could be justified if some of these corporations receive money, but even then, it's really a stretch to come up with those. Then the requirement for same-day voter registration, which has nothing to do with the coronavirus, immigration prohibiting institutions of higher learning from disclosing the immigration status of students, the deinstitutionalization of various individuals, and then, of course, the environmental regulations, the whole idea of sustainable aviation fuel, mandatory carbon offsets. The list goes on and on and on. But if you'd like to read that, some of you have been asking a very important question. Did some of that end up in the final legislation? I guess once it is actually passed, we'll be able to give you a better report. But if nothing else, will this legislation help individuals? And that is, matter of fact, one of the questions came in from individual off a line here, so I'll just see if I can answer that. When we look at this bill, we are talking about, again, $2 trillion. But there are some benefits. The first, of course, is business loan and forgiveness for businesses that have been affected by this essential shutdown, shelter in place or lockdowns or whatever. Now the lockdowns in Los Angeles, we were just hearing about this a minute ago, say if a company or a business doesn't, they'll shut off the electricity and the water to them. Oh, this is getting pretty intense. But nevertheless, the bill at the moment, and again, all of this can change by tomorrow, about $300 billion in loans. Now, how this would help businesses is that it would a business could receive a maximum of about 2.5 months worth of payroll costs, up to a maximum of $10 million. And that's because in some cases, individuals have been able to actually shut down their business, but they haven't been able to provide the products or services, but they have decided to keep those people on the payroll, so they would get some relief for that. Number two, what about those who unfortunately had to fire or lay off individuals? There is an incentive in this to actually give to employers credits or loan forgiveness for those that have laid off workers after March 1st. So that would be the case. There are all sorts of unemployment insurance benefits. For those of you filing taxes, we've talked about this before, it would move the deadline from April 15th, of course, to July 15th, which is helpful not just for individuals like yourself, but businesses, too, because they could also delay paying the portion of their employees' payroll taxes. That might give them a benefit. And then for individuals, it depends on where you are, but this provides, at least theoretically, we're going to see how this all gets implemented, rebates that amount to about $1,200 per individual, $2,400 for a married couple, plus additional amounts for children, depending on where you are in that process, which phase out beginning at incomes of about $75,000 for individuals, $150,000 for married couples. And then individuals that maybe are retired, that was one of the questions somebody was asking. This actually allows individuals to withdraw up to $100,000 from their retirement accounts penalty-free through the end of 2020. So that could be a benefit for people that are simply saying, I really do need to have access to some cash, and I have it locked away, but I don't want to necessarily have to pay a penalty. We're withdrawing it, so those are some issues. All sorts of other things, massive loans. And interestingly enough, even though this provides some real benefits for paid sick leave and family leave for smaller employers, it really doesn't do much for large employers. So, of course, you've heard people saying this is just simply a bailout for corporations. I think that was as much a talking point as maybe there is some action to that as well, because as I've mentioned before, let's face it, on both sides, there are pressures. And if you've ever taken a class in political science or government, you probably have heard the term log rolling. Well, what's log rolling? Well, that's where I will support your bill if you'll support my bill. Or I'll put this provision in because that's what you want in the bill if you put that provision in the bill. And so there is a fair amount of gamemanship that oftentimes takes place on Capitol Hill. We understand that. I'm not naive about this. On the left are the Democrat side. There's pressures from the unions, from feminists, from pro-abortionists, from environmentalists, from various activist groups, and from the right or on the Republican side, there's pressures from Chamber of Commerce, K Street lobbyists, to pro-life groups. I mean, we know that, understand that, but this is something that has caused even some of the most cynical people in Washington, D.C. to just simply say, I have never seen anything like this before. So let's hope that most of those provisions being put forward by Nancy Pelosi and some of the people associated with her go nowhere. And when we come back from the break, I want to briefly talk about, first of all, the bipartisan attempt to hold the Chinese government financially accountable. And then let's look at the hospitals, because one of the reasons we are doing shelter in place or lockdowns or talking about social distancing is so that in many of these states and many of these cities, we don't overwhelm the hospital system. So when I come back, Jim Garrity's given us a little bit of numbers, and I've got a few more here. Of course, the area where there is the greatest concern right now is, of course, New York. for a couple of reasons. First of all, New York City, high-density population, very cosmopolitan, a lot of people that have been coming in and through New York, through LaGuardia, John F. Kennedy, and others. These are all important issues, so we'll be talking about that. But also, I want to kind of hopscotch around the country from the East Coast to the West Coast and give you a little bit of where we are in some of these places in terms of hospital beds, intensive care units, ventilators, and the rest. So we'll take a break and we'll spend some time looking at that briefly. Then in the next hour, we're going to be talking briefly with Pastor Robert Jeffress, his new book out on Courageous, 10 Strategies for Thriving in a Hostile World. Thought it would be a good book to talk about. Also want to find out a little bit more about what's going on at First Baptist Church, and then we'll get back into a couple of the other issues of the coronavirus. We have to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the articles we posted here is something I don't think I would have ever seen, a name of Biden with Trump actually working together. Now, no, it's not those individuals, but I thought it's kind of interesting here. A law firm advised by the younger brother of the former Vice President, Joe Biden, has partnered with a lobbying shop that has deep connections to President Donald Trump. You didn't think Biden and Trump would be working together? Indirectly, they are. And they are pushing what's called a federal class action lawsuit seeking to hold the government of China accountable for the economic carnage that has come from their mishandling of the coronavirus crisis. And again, this is an organization that is advised by Francis Biden. And it is interesting, Left, because if you go to the Berman Law Group, one of the speakers there says, we believe that this is not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. This is an American issue. The best way to do this is with a bipartisan effort to hold China accountable. Anyone who is willing to participate and help, we plan to work with and help move forward this lawsuit to collect for the citizens of the United States for this terrible tragedy that's happened. By the way, I don't know this is going to go anywhere, but I thought it was kind of interesting. And then you also have another group, Lucas Compton, and the managing partner there said we should be unified in our response and our strategy about how we manage and navigate the situation with the government of China. The government of China needs to be held accountable not only to its people, but also the rest of the world. So one of the things I thought I would post here is sort of an unexpected bipartisan response to this as well. But let's, if we can, look at another piece that we have, and that is to ask a question about where we stand in terms of these hospital beds. This article coming out, and we've posted on the website here, reminds us that this is yesterday, so the numbers are a little different. But right now, yesterday on Tuesday, the coronavirus death count jumped to more than 222 in 24 hours to a total of 780 fatalities among the 55,000 confirmed cases. And among those cases, there were, interestingly, 26,000 of those in New York State alone. So without a doubt, New York State is in a very different set of circumstances than the rest of the nation. In New York City, the rate of new infections is doubling about every 3 days, according to the governor, Andrew Cuomo. And so in some respects, this has been of real concern, and officials there are trying to double their hospital capacity up to about 110,000 beds. And so that's what's happening in New York. But I thought it would be good to maybe kind of hop around the country here and recognize what is necessarily the big issue. Let's again be honest enough to say that a very significant number of people that get this COVID-19 virus recover. Some only show minor symptoms. And so we're not talking about the 80+%. We're talking about those who will need some kind of treatment. The U.S. Army has already deployed 3 military hospitals to Washington State and also to the state of New York. But still, we can see that if we start looking at some of these different states and some of these different communities, that is the case. So let's go to our listeners, first of all, in Georgia. The Atlanta mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, said in a television interview that really, as far as she could determine, the city's hospitals are already at capacity. What about elsewhere in Georgia? Well, we can find a few things there. Let's go to, for example, one of the hospitals in Albany. Dr. Stephen Kitchen said in a televised interview that the hospital's 3 ICUs are already filled, and the hospital has improvised a 4th 10-bed unit for non-COVID-19 patients. He said that unit is also full, too. So, again, when you start looking at hospital beds and ICU units and ventilators, we're already starting to reach capacity in some of those areas. Let's move to the state of Alabama. Some of our listeners in Alabama maybe have seen this, and that is the public health officer, Scott Harris, of the Alabama Department of Public Health, at a press conference, this was on Monday, urged those individuals to take the pandemic seriously and abide by that, because he was pointing out that the number of hospitals in the state of Alabama was already nearing capacity as well. And then let's, if we can now, maybe move to our listeners in Louisiana. The governor of Louisiana declared, at least in a letter to President Donald Trump, that he fears the state's hospital capacity will hit its limit on April 4th. So it hasn't hit it yet, but you can kind of see where that is taking us. I am broadcasting today from Dallas in our studio. In the future, who knows, it might be broadcasting from my home, but at the moment, we're still in our studio. And in that particular case in Dallas, you already are starting to see that one of the hospital associations in this area sent a letter to the governor of the state of Texas, that'd be Governor Greg Abbott, that if nothing changes, their estimate is that more than 200,000 Texans will be hospitalized by the middle of May. And that kind of outpaces the 50,000 beds that are available. I mean, you can do the math and figure that one out. Let's go to a couple other places. We'll go to Michigan this time. Now, this is southeastern Michigan. I don't know that we have as many people in that part of Michigan, but for you up in Michigan there, already talking about the fact that one of the hospitals there, Beaumont Health, is caring for about 635 patients confirmed or at least suspected with having COVID-19, and that's putting pressure on their hospital system in terms of staffing, protection equipment, and ventilators. And then in another one, there are some other surveys. This one says that in Idaho, Oregon, Colorado, and New Mexico, more than 19,000 citizens over the age of 65 live in counties without hospital beds. Fortunately, a lot of those people in the counties are not necessarily infected. Some of those counties, even state of Texas, you go out to West Texas, a place like that, there are all sorts of places where the entire county, they do not have anybody that is tested positive for COVID-19, but you can see what that is. But let's bring us back to the two primary focuses, well, two of the three, New York and California. And in New York, of course, they're also not only running into difficulties, but even across the way in New Jersey, the Holy Name Medical Center is nearing its capacity and supply stock. And even in Suffolk County and Long Island, we are still seeing that in many cases they're getting close to capacity there. And in California, the hospitals are expanding capacity as fast as they can, but one survey said that at most local hospitals, there isn't much room for new patients. The Governor Gavin Newsom said that 50,000 additional hospital beds would be needed statewide to cope with the outbreak. And in Los Angeles County, 90% of the ICU beds are already occupied, even with facilities in recent days doubling the number of available beds. So the point I'm making is that it is easy if you know individuals that are recovered, and more than 100,000 people worldwide have indeed recovered. And maybe you know some people that have had the virus and are doing quite well. The real issue, and the issue that has been front and center, is what about those people that need hospital beds? They need an ICU unit. They need a ventilator. So it's certainly a matter of prayer. And we will bring that information to you a little bit later. And also, I want to, when we come back, spend some time, first of all, talking with Dr. Robert Jeffress, but then we want to talk about, when does this end? Do we have any indication of that? What might be the economic fallout, and a couple of other issues? So I really want to try to cover as many of these questions as we possibly can. And in that last half hour, I just want to open up the phones for your comments. I know some of you perhaps have some thoughts, some questions, and feel free to disagree, trying to give you as many facts and figures as we can. Some people say, well, you're just fear-mongering. No, I'm actually giving you the numbers that are coming from all sorts of news sources, and trying to give you the best information that we have. Let's take a break, though. We'll come back and spend a little bit of time talking with Pastor Robert Jeffress, and then we'll take your phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking with our good friend Dr. Robert Jeffress about his new book, Courageous: 10 Strategies for Thriving in a Hostile World. Then I'm going to go back to some of the questions about the coronavirus, some questions about some of the misinformation, what about the economic issues, and a variety of other topics that we will get into. And, of course, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation as well. Dr. Robert Jeffress, of course, is the senior pastor of the 13,000-member First Baptist Church, also serves as a member of the executive committee on the White House Faith Initiative. You hear his daily radio program, Pathway to Victory. He's the author of more than 24 books. And Robert Jeffress, always great to have you on the program with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, talk about what you've had to deal with at First Baptist. Every time I have a pastor on here, I ask, well, how is your church coping? And you are in the midst of the Dallas area, where you've had the county judge of Dallas wanting to close down lots of things. And, of course, there has been this idea of individuals having to stay at home. So how have you coped there at First Baptist?
Well, we followed the letter of the law, and happy to do that. We were open, one of the few churches that remained open March 15th, because, and we worked with the city on this, they were allowing groups of 500 or more, like you have in a movie theater. You may have thousands in a movie theater, they said, but nobody more than 500 in one venue at a time. So we worked with them on that, and March 15th, we had services with no more than 500 in them in different venues. And then came the order that no more than 10 should be gathering together. So we complied with that. We went online completely last Sunday, and we had over 200,000 people watch our service online last Sunday. So it was a tremendous opportunity to meet new friends on our social media and to minister to them. And, you know, I found, Kerby, people are really open to the gospel, to anything that offers hope right now. And we're finding new ways to minister to people through social media, having Sunday school classes, you know, using Zoom. We're going to have prayer meeting tonight on Zoom. Our music minister is going to have a virtual choir practice. I'm not sure how that works. And I got a little bored yesterday, so I recorded a video for our church of me playing the accordion, singing, "I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart." So we're doing all kinds of things.
You are. Let me just mention that, again, if you're not familiar with Pathway to Victory, we have a link to ptv.org. One of the special downloads is the Coronavirus a Judgment from God, a bold biblical response from Dr. Robert Jeffress. Might get to that a little bit later, but I did want to spend some time talking about your book. For I'm very familiar with the book, and, of course, since my wife and I support you, we had already seen a copy, but I thought it's so appropriate now, because we always need to be courageous, but at a time when fear and uncertainty surround so many of us, this is a place where I think Christians can stand out. And if indeed we want to use Joshua as our good example of being strong and courageous, this is a real opportunity, and that's really kind of how you start your book.
Well, it is. And, you know, I wrote this book a year ago, had no idea when it was released. It'd be released the month of the coronavirus, but God knew what he was doing. And what I talk about in the book, Courageous, is 10 strategies for thriving in a hostile world. And, Kerby, C.S. Lewis said it best when he described this world as enemy-occupied territory. And if you're a Christian trying to live out your faith, you understand that. We've got attacks from without, a culture that's increasingly hostile toward the things of God, not just to mention the everyday challenges like coronavirus. We have attacks from within. We've got that old sin nature that still tries to pull us away from God. And if those things weren't enough, we've got attacks from below, an adversary, the devil, who's hell-bent on destroying everything important to us. And yet, God wants us to do more than just survive. He wants us to thrive in the midst of these attacks. And what I did, Kerby, was I took the 10 survival tactics the survivalists tell us you need to use if you're in an avalanche or an airplane crash. Things like don't panic, remember your training, do the next right thing, and I applied them to how to live our Christian faith. And my friend Oliver North, he read the manuscript for this book, and he said, I have taught these same survival tactics for decades to Marines. It never occurred to me until now that you can apply them to the Christian life as well.
I loved his line about that.
I think it's a very practical book anytime, but certainly right now.
Yeah, he says, I have 4 kids and 18 grandkids. It never occurred to me to apply these skills, and so very good because, again, 10 survival tips. One, of course, is don't panic. Let me take another one, gain situational awareness. I'm aware of that, but I love how you tie that into 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, because it tells us that the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. We should understand our times. We should understand our set of circumstances, and we shouldn't panic, but we also should understand this world and recognize this is just a great opportunity, isn't it?
It is. And by the way, that's why I love Point of View and what you're doing, Kerby. You help people gain situational awareness. And you've got to be realistic. You know, we talk about the sons of Issachar, 1 Chronicles 12, men who understood their times and knew what Israel should do. And every now and then I run into these Christians who are holier than God, you know the kind I'm talking about, and they say things like, oh, I don't watch the news, I don't keep up with that, I just read my Bible. That's all I'm interested in. I read my Bible. Well, there's a word for that. Ignorant. I mean, God does not want us just to read our Bible. Again, those sons of Issachar, they understood the climate in which they were living. You probably know Billy Graham was a member of our church, First Baptist Dallas, for 54 years. And he used to say, I go through life with a newspaper in one hand and my Bible in the other hand. The newspaper tells me what is happening. The Bible tells me what it means.
That's so good. We're going to take a break, and we come back. Maybe we'll focus on one that you just mentioned, trust your training, because that is really a very good chapter. It talks about, of course, training in God's Word and a number of other things. But in case you're wondering what the 10 survival tips are, let me just mention those before we take a break. The first one, of course, is don't panic, which we talked about. Gain situational awareness. Number 3, take inventory. Number 4, develop a victor, not victim mindset. Oh, how important that is. One we'll talk about when we come back. Trust your training. Number 6, bend, don't break. Beware of celebrating the summit. Learn from the past. Number 9, help others. And number 10, do the right thing. And this is written in such a way that it really will be an encouragement. It was an attempt to really help us understand that we're going to have to be courageous at a time when we live in an environment that maybe is somewhat hostile to Christian ideas, and certainly we need to be able to show courage in the midst of that. There's no reason for panic, and there's all the reason in the Word for us to go into God's Word and to learn more about how to apply these principles. And so when we come back, we'll talk about what it means to trust your training. That is something we talk about so often, even when you talk about what might be necessarily called for in difficult emergency situations, but also we can talk about the training that we receive in God's Word and the training in the sense that we've been receiving as we grow in Christ. And then we'll take on just a couple of other survival tips, but I love the comment again by Oliver North, who'll be with us next week during our Truth Team Week. Of course, he has talked about the fact that he used those survival skills as a Marine, even as in the Boy Scouts, but hadn't really thought about it in terms of applying it day to day. So we're going to apply some of those very important strategies to you right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
By now, you've probably received an envelope in the mail that says United States Census 2020. You're supposed to go online and fill it out before April 1st. There are many reasons why you should do so. The most important reason is the fact that the census count will determine how many representatives you will have in the future. The state you're living in has changed significantly in the last 10 years when the last census was taken. Those changing numbers will be used by your state legislature in 2021 to redraw the lines for Congress, the state legislature, the State Board of Education, and various courts. The Census Bureau is required to get the data to state legislatures by this time next year, but the hope is that it will arrive earlier. Then the process of drawing these lines will begin. How that is done varies from state to state. Legislators draw lines in most states, while commissions draw lines in others. As you might imagine, Democratic legislators would like the lines drawn so there are potentially more Democratic districts. Republicans would like boundaries drawn so that more Republicans could be elected. There are other issues to consider. For example, most state laws require districts to follow county lines whenever that is possible. Sometimes numerous counties must be bunched together in areas with low population density. Citizens would like to keep cities, towns, and school districts together. Getting all of that in a single district is sometimes difficult. Add to that the requirement from the Voting Rights Act that require boundaries assure that anyone has the right to vote based on race, ethnicity, and language group. And this law has also provided a context for bringing numerous lawsuits against states once the maps are drawn. In order to start this process, you need to fill out the census. Then you need to express your views about the drawing of districts for the next decade. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Robert Jeffress as we talk about his book, which is published by Baker Books, and it is entitled Courageous 10 Strategies for Thriving in a Hostile World. Of course, there are 10 strategies. We're only going to focus on a few, but Dr. Jeffress, I thought, if nothing else, let's talk about this idea of trust your training. If nothing else, a shout out again of thanks to all of our first responders, police officers, firefighters, people, military personnel, doctors, nurses, all sorts of other individuals. They hear the phrase so often, trust your training. Well, you take that to talk about the importance of training in God's Word and also the importance of Scripture memory. Tell us more if you might.
Yeah, you know, every chapter of Courageous I open up with a real-life survival story that illustrates the principle. I start that chapter with the story of Sully Sullenberger, the captain of the U.S. airplane that he landed into the Hudson River after it lost both of its engines. And people asked Sullenberger, how did you do that? He said, oh, it was easy. I trusted my training. He had been through that maneuver countless times before. He knew exactly what to do. And I contrast that with two pilots of a Lion Air 737 who found their plane pitching downward. They didn't know what to do as it approached the earth, crashing. They were flipping through the flight manual, trying to search for the right answer when they crashed and killed everybody aboard. You know, if you wait until you're in a crisis, Kerby, to search the flight manual to discover what you're doing,
yes.
You've waited too long.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. saying when we are faced with crises in our life or temptations, we need to already know where to go in Scripture and what resources to use. And Jesus illustrated that when he was tempted by Satan in the wilderness. I mean, can you imagine Satan tempting Jesus and Jesus saying to Satan, "Now, Satan, if you'll wait just a moment, let me flip through the scrolls of Deuteronomy. I know there's a verse in here somewhere." It doesn't work that way. We need to be trained in righteousness before the crisis.
Oh, so good. And again, that is in chapter 5. But in chapter 6, I thought we'd also maybe talk about this idea of bend, don't break, because that's important. We're going to be facing all sorts of challenges, and this is just one of those. And it seems to me that we should certainly be peacemakers, and we should certainly recognize that sometimes we have to pick our battles. And the example that you use there is Daniel, if nothing else, because what we have to recognize is that there were times when Daniel said, I'm not going to pick a fight on this one, but I would like to make sure that we are not eating meat sacrificed to idols that's not kosher. But in other situations, this is, if you will, a deal breaker. And there's a sense in which sometimes we need to know how to bend without breaking, don't we?
That's right. And this coronavirus crisis provides a great opportunity to illustrate that. I mean, there are some churches, that are trying to make the headlines by saying, we're going to keep meeting, First Amendment and so forth, and we're going to keep meeting. And I think they are bringing disrepute to the name of Christ by doing that. Look, I'm very sensitive to First Amendment rights, and if I had the idea that this was some covert action on the government to take away religious liberty, I'd be the first to stand against it. But it's not. This is a real threat we're facing right now, and I just think we can't make every issue a federal issue. We need to have some elasticity. We never compromise on convictions that are rooted in the Word of God, but sometimes our convictions are just our own preferences, and that's not a hill you need to die on.
I would certainly agree. One other one, and then I thought maybe I'd talk about your coronavirus, a judgment from God, but Chapter 9, Help Others. What a great opportunity, Dr. Jeffress, right now. I mean, there are so many individuals with needs that we've told all sorts of stories. It's amazing how in a crisis, whether it's a tragedy, a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, or a pandemic, it brings out the best in people and the worst in people. And I've been trying to highlight the best in people that have gone into grocery stores and given people various debit cards, people going out and delivering food. But this idea of helping others is a good survival technique, but it also is one of the great mandates right now for us to be the arms and feet of Jesus, right?
That's right. I mean, we're to love our neighbors as ourselves, and that's just a basic principle of Scripture. And helping others are all kind of people we can help. But, the first group we're responsible for helping is our own family, especially spiritually speaking. I would remind all of our listeners that this is such a monumental crisis we're going through as a country right now. It is something that our children and our grandchildren will remember forever. And what they're going to remember is how we responded. Did we respond with faith or with fear? Did we respond with every man for himself, or let's help others as well? This is a great chance for us who are parents and grandparents to model what it really means to trust God.
Again, the book is entitled Courageous. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore because it is out, but I want to also encourage you to go to ptv.org because, Pastor Jeffress, we are talking about the fact that you have a leader kit. You also have a courageous encouragement cards and a number of other things. So in addition to the book, as people go to your website, they're going to find some great resources, aren't they?
That's exactly right. And again, there couldn't be a more timely book right now. I think about A.W. Tozer's words. Kerby, he said, a scared world needs a fearless church. And this is a time for the Church of Jesus Christ to be fearless and courageous.
One other point just before I let you go, and that is the coronavirus a judgment from God? As people go to ptv.org, they can get a free download. I know you preached on it. As a matter of fact, I saw the bulletin boards and the billboards and everything advertising it. And so for the listeners that aren't in the Dallas area that did not tune in, give us just a little bit of a thumbnail sketch on what you said.
Well, look, first of all, some people say, well, God would never send a disease as a judgment. Well, they need to read their Bible. Of course, he would in the past. He has in the past. He did so with Egypt. He sent the boils. He used pestilence. We know from the book of Revelation, in the future, he will use diseases as one of his judgments, Revelation chapter 6. But whether or not this present is a judgment from God, I can't say. I mean, it could be a judgment from God, but it could be just the result of living in a fallen world. You know, God did not create the world we live in as it is right now. He never meant for the world to have disease and death in it. And the good news is it won't always have disease in it. One day Christ is coming back to recreate the world. So whether or not this is a judgment from God is nothing I'm qualified to say. In fact, the Bible warns against any prophet of God making a pronouncement that God has not authorized him to speak. And I would just say to you, anybody who pretends to know, any so-called prophet who says this is a judgment from God for this or this or this or this, is either a crank or a crook. You know, we just don't know.
Oh, for sure. And again, we have information about that at ptv.org. And Dr. Jeffress, just before I let you go, you know the president. I've never met him. You know the vice president. I've met him before, but it's been a long time. But it does seem to me that the amount of pressure that some of us face is small in comparison to the amount of pressure that the president, the vice president, the coronavirus task force are facing right now. So wouldn't you encourage us to be praying for those in authority over us?
Absolutely. And look, the coronavirus is neither Democrat nor Republican. This is something all Americans are facing. I'm grateful for a president and a vice president who are not too proud to call on God for help. You know, the president said in his declaration of the day of prayer last week, in times past, in times of crises, America has looked to God, and we need to look to God right now.
I would certainly think so as well. Dr. Robert Jeffress, again, as people go to the website, you've got some great resources, and at a time when there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, people can get the book, they can get the cards, they can get all sorts of other DVDs and other resources, so you're encouraging people to go there and to be individuals that are strong and courageous and understand the times in which they live, and to go out there and to be victors rather than victims. And so those are just a couple of great illustrations in this. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about those 10 strategies that would help you in a crisis, you can apply those same ones to your Christian life. So Dr. Robert Jeffress, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Kerby. Appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212, and we will give you a chance to make some comments about anything you've just heard, or I do want to cover a few other things. There is a fair amount of misinformation about the coronavirus, and some of those have been communicated by, well, in one case, the former Vice President, Joe Biden. So I wanted to talk about that. There are some people that are saying, well, how long is this going to last, and what will be possibly the implications economically? So we'll get into those issues as well. And, of course, we've talked about the fact that we are going to see the signing, first of all, the passing and then the signing of the largest rescue package in the history of this country. Let's hope that it does some good, because there are some really significant challenges, not the least of which is many of you probably say, I can relate to the survey that was done that said if you had an unexpected expense of $1,000, I wouldn't be able to cover it with money in my savings right now, and so what would I have to do? So we'll talk about those issues, and of course want to give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to add a comment, ask a question, agree or disagree, we give you that opportunity. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked a little bit about, of course, the largest rescue package in American history. Talked a little bit about what's in it, and maybe it will provide some relief. But, of course, the real question that people have is whether that would be enough. I've mentioned on this program before surveys that were done in the past. The most recent one done by Bankrate, which came to the same conclusion as every other survey, and that is they ask a question: if you had to pay $1,000 for an unexpected expense, could you do so? And about 40% of Americans said they would be able to, but what about the other 60%? Well, the other 60% said, well, they'd have to borrow money in some way, perhaps a credit card or personal loan from a family or friends. Some said they might reduce spending. A lot of them just simply said, I don't know what would do. But nevertheless, we could maybe cut back on some things. Most Americans have a cell phone. A lot of Americans, as we know, a very high percentage, go out to eat at least once a week. A good number go out at least 3 or more times a week. So you might be able to cut back for a while. But that is, of course, one of the great challenges we face. The other one, of course, as we've been talking about there, just the number of hospital beds. In many cases, again, when I sometimes go out on Facebook and we post something, people will say, well, everybody's getting better. Yeah, 100,000 people have recovered from the coronavirus. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the people that aren't the 80+%. I'm talking about the others that might need a hospital bed, might need ICU units, might need some kind of ventilator. So that is an issue as well. So anyway, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But let's, if we can, talk about some of the misinformation. And we need to be prepared for this. You're going to be hearing more and more things. We know that there are probably everything from Russian hackers to Chinese disinformation that's going to take place. But more recently, Peter Hasson, the editor of the Daily Caller, put together 5 examples of where the former Vice President, Joe Biden, keeps pushing misinformation. And you might say, well, we're not in a campaign right now. No, but I'm already starting to see some of these statements that were made out on the campaign trail. Some of them have showed up in various Twitter posts. Many of them have earned a 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post or have been discounted by the Associated Press. But one of the things I really want to encourage you to do is during this election season and during this time in which we have the virus crisis, to really exercise some discernment. So real quickly, I'm going to go through these 5 and then get into some other topics because there are many other things to talk about. But one of the first ones is that the former Vice President Joe Biden falsely said that Donald Trump and his administration slashed the budget of the Centers for Disease Control. Well, that one is obviously not the case. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't even have to take Peter Hasson's word for it, or even Donald Trump's word for it. The Associated Press got together and did a fact check and basically argued that they are both wrong, meaning both Joe Biden and Mike Bloomberg, both wrong in making the false accusation that they did during the debate that the budget was cut. How would they even get to that? And as I've said on this program so many times, but let me say it one more time, only in Washington, D.C., when you increase a budget, is it still called a cut? In other words, if you're going to increase a budget 8% and they only increase it 5%, that's called a cut. That's not a cut in the real world, but it is a cut sometimes to people in Washington, D.C. I'm not even sure that one fits into that category, but once the statement is made, it's out there, and then it's hard to really pull back. The second one is that the former Vice President, Joe Biden, falsely said that Donald Trump rejected various tests, coronavirus tests, from the World Health Organization. He said during one of the debates, the World Health Organization offered the testing kits that they have available and were going to give it to us now. We refused them. We did not want to buy them. Well, again, you can go to PolitiFact. You don't have to trust the Trump administration or me or anybody else. Just go to PolitiFact right now, and their statement is the World Health Organization never offered to sell test kits to the United States. Again, a false statement, and again, a reason for you to exercise some discernment. Number 3, this one is some concern because it's now a video that's out and people are watching it, and it's false at its very core. The Biden campaign put out a video falsely claiming that Donald Trump called the virus a hoax. Now, if you haven't seen this, it says we can basically say that he called the coronavirus, this is a new hoax. And what it did was splice together two different statements, separated, I think somebody said by about 100 words or something. I forget exactly the exact number there. And this, again, was called a fake point because, again, as PolitiFact has pointed out, the video makes it seem like Donald Trump is calling the disease itself a hoax, which he hasn't done. The words are Trump's, but they're edited by the Biden campaign to put a comment about the attempt to try to make this against the Trump administration a hoax, not the virus itself. Well, let's take the fourth one. The Biden campaign also falsely accused Donald Trump and the Trump administration of silencing a CDC official. In that particular video there, the claim was made that he silenced one of the CDC officials. And yet again, you can go to the Washington Post itself and simply said the framing of the situation is simply false. And again, one more example of a false claim. And the fifth one, it's really even hard to take seriously, but okay, this is the fifth one, that Joe Biden, the former Vice President Biden, falsely said that he hasn't criticized the president's coronavirus response. I mean, that one does not even pass the straight face test. I'm sorry. But nevertheless, on The View, he made the comment the other day that he hasn't criticized Donald Trump on the coronavirus. Let's just take one of the tweets here by Joe Biden. Donald Trump is wholly unfit to lead this nation, and that has become even clearer in the last few days. And, of course, I can give you some others, but that just, it's even hard to take that one seriously. But nevertheless, it's out there, and just one of the reasons why you need to have some level of discernment when you hear some of these claims. Let's, if we can, just before we wind down the program here today, talk about the economic recovery. The assumption has always been that this is going to harm the economy, and it is. But that it would be like a V. We'd have a downward drop, and then we'd have a spike, and it would be a V. There's more and more evidence that's saying it's not going to be a V. It's going to be like a U with a long intermediate pause here, because we have so many people, first of all, that are losing their jobs. For our listeners out there in Pennsylvania, let me use your state. The Keystone State is an example here. Well, last week, we had more than 350,000 first-time claims for unemployment assistance in the state of Pennsylvania. To put that in perspective, the national claims last year at this time were about 200,000. So this is more than the entire nation in just one state. And the news is going to get worse, probably not only in Pennsylvania, but in many other states as well. So what does that mean? Well, Goldman Sachs estimates that the U.S. GDP, gross domestic product, would tumble and maybe drop by 24%. So that would be a minus 24% GDP, which is just horrific, if nothing else. But nevertheless, hoping that maybe by the third quarter, it could actually be a positive of maybe 12%. I just have trouble believing that that would be the case. But if that's the case, that might be good news. And again, some of the estimates from Goldman Sachs economists, maybe unemployment would peak at 9%. Well, 9% is still an enormous amount compared to when we were at about 3%, but we'll see where that kind of takes us. And then when we come back from the break, what I want to try to do for just a minute is talk about what kind of drives the economy. I'll give you a hint. Consumer spending is part of what drives the economy. But more importantly, what about this kind of economic shutdown? And that's led some people to simply say, look, if we're going to continue to harm the economy, maybe we should take our foot off the brakes. You might have seen the other day where Glenn Beck said that older Americans, he thinks, should return to work. Even if we all get sick, I'd rather die than kill the country. Whoa. And the other day, the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas, Dan Patrick, And he was on, I think it was on with Tucker Carlson, said, let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it. And those of us that are 70 plus will take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country. And some people have said, well, maybe this is kind of a false choice, but it is a concern that some people that are now over the age of 65 are saying, I'd rather go back into the workforce, run the risk of dying rather than kill the economy. So we'll come back and talk about what's the long-term prognosis for the economy in light of some of the shelter in place and lockdowns. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, some people wanting to know what's going to happen economically. Tomorrow we'll have Steve Moore on with us at about this time, and we were going to talk a little bit about some of the economic successes under the Trump administration, which I think are going to fade into a distant memory as we face what could be a GDP of minus 24% or unemployment at 9%. So we're going to talk about that and where we go from here. But before I take some phone calls, let me just mention real quickly that about 70% of the GDP is consumer spending. So you can honestly see that if people are at home, maybe some of you are encouraged to maybe go occasionally out to a fast food restaurant through drive-through or maybe order some things on Amazon. You can see that that is one of the reasons why the economy is tanking at the moment. And let's face it, let's look down the road a little bit, because even if all the people right now that have been furloughed, laid off, fired could resume what they're doing, and that, of course, is not going to happen anytime soon. President believes that would happen by Easter. I have real doubts about that. But nevertheless, let's even assume that's the case. The people that then get back to work, they're going to be not where they were a few weeks ago. They're probably going to have drained their savings. They may have gone deeper into debt. So that is going to affect consumer spending as well. And then, of course, even if the lockdowns are eased, maybe people that aren't traveling right now might still be hesitant to go travel. So that could certainly not bode well for the airlines. And so in some respects, this idea of a V-shaped curve, that it would drop and then race back and roar back, I'm not so sure that happens anytime soon. It's going to look less like a V and more like a very elongated U, I suspect. But nevertheless, that is certainly the case. And one of the reasons why you're hearing some of these statements, like I said, Glenn Beck the other day posted, he said, even if we all get sick, I'd rather die than kill the country. He was having a frank conversation with people on radio. And, of course, you also have the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick saying, let's just get back to work, Indeed, that is an important issue that we should be concerned about. But I think he said he was 69 years of age, and he simply says, I am willing to take some kind of risk simply so that we don't destroy this economy for our children and grandchildren. So we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of days. But I did, as we got near the end, wanted to talk about prayer for a couple of reasons. First of all, one of our callers wants to talk about that. But also our good friend Jerry Newcomb recently has pointed out that we have had lots of national days of prayer. And I'll give you those numbers in just a minute. But even when the president called for a day of prayer and said we are a country that throughout our history has looked to God for protection and strength in these times like these, you've had all sorts of people, and I'll give you a couple of quotes in just a minute, of individuals who have simply said, forget about praying. You need to do something. Prayer is not going to do any good whatsoever. But I know our next caller wants to counter that, so let me go to Diane in Georgia. Diane, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for allowing me to call in. But I wanted to encourage the people of God, as you was doing so, to read 2 Chronicles, the 7th chapter, and the 14th verse. It was saying, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. And our land is in need of a healing. And we need to pray for our leader and all of those in leading positions that putting themselves in harm's way, to pray for them, uplift them, ask God to give them wisdom and guidance and protection, and as well as heal our land. And this is what he was telling us in his word, that if we would just humble ourselves, and if we would just pray and just seek the face of God and turn from our wicked ways, he said, I'll hear from heaven and I'll forgive their sins and I'll heal their land. And that's what we're in need of. It's just simple as that, along with all the other natural things that common sense and wisdom and knowledge tell us to do. We can't forsake the message of God in order for, to survive alone, but we need our Creator, and our Creator know what it takes to heal our land. And this is what he had given us. He have given us his word. He have given us instruction, as well as the instructions of our leaders. We put these together, we can't do nothing but get our land healed.
Well, again, I think you brought a great admonition for us to all pray. And, Diane, I appreciate you sharing that. And just before we run out of time, let me just mention a little bit from Jerry Newcomb's piece, because he reminds us that we had this National Day of Prayer the other day, and it wasn't well covered simply because the president announced it even after we went off the air, so we didn't cover it very well as well. But nevertheless, he points out that one of the Parkland shooters said, don't let this administration address COVID-19 like the national gun violence, and then then he uses some expletives about the National Day of Prayer. And you have, of course, a Representative Rashida Tlaib who wanted to impeach this president and used some different words and retweeted that. So there are all sorts of people that have been critical of the president for praying. But if you go back to, first of all, Diane reminding us of going to 2 Chronicles 7:14, but even if you go back to our history, he quotes from David Barton, who Elvis illustrates that between 1633 and 1812, there were 1,700 different prayer proclamations in the colonies. This is where the governor would oftentimes call the state to an annual day of prayer and fasting, sometimes of a time of prayer and thanksgiving. And just as we close, let's talk about two times in which this nation has followed 2 Chronicles 7:14. We can go to, first of all, June 12th in 1775. This is where the Continental Congress called for a day of public prayer, humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we might with united hearts and voices unfamed confess and deplore our many sins and offer up our joint supplications to all-wise, omnipotent, and merciful deposer of all events. And then it goes on with some other incredible statements calling for a national day and a day of public prayer when the Continental Congress met in 1775. Well, then, a year later, March 16th in 1776, as it became more obvious that we might be actually headed toward an American Revolution, the Continental Congress then called for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we may with united hearts confess and bewail our manifold sins and transgressions, and by a sincere repentance and amendment of life appease his righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ obtain his pardon and forgiveness. That's how the people used to talk back in the 18th century. I think we need to come back to it as well. And it's just a reminder, I think, for all of us that indeed we surely need to pray for this country. As I asked Robert Jeffress, shouldn't we be praying for the president and the vice president and for the coronavirus task force, pray for the governors and others? But most importantly, let me also end by talking about praying for those on the front lines, the first responders, the doctors, the nurses, the medical personnel. We salute you, and we certainly will spend some time tomorrow talking about some of these important issues right here on Point of View. Well, we are your lifeline as you are maybe actually sheltered in place at home, and hope you'll be listening every single day here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Tomorrow we've got a number of guests that I'm looking forward to talking with, and most importantly, I hope you'll join us right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I agree.